Thank you for joining today. My name is Beth Sherman. I'm a partner with Pharmaceutical Consulting. Before we get started today, a few quick housekeeping items. The presentation will be recorded and we will be sharing that with those of you who registered through your email accounts moving forward. There is an open Q&A session. You are able to submit questions via the Q&A link on your screen. There should be an icon in the top right-hand corner and we'll answer questions at the end. Our topic today is COVID-19, navigating the new normal in pharmaceutical commercialization. It's part of our U.S. Thought Leadership Series. There will be future webinars, so please look for email invites for future events. Hopefully today will be very helpful for you. I'm Beth Sherman, partner with Hirschspiegel. I'm going to turn it over to Brent to kick us off.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Brent Hirschspiegel. Thank you for joining the call. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedules this morning to share with us our thoughts on this topic. I know that we have a mixture of clients and folks that haven't worked with us in the past, so I appreciate you both joining. For those that aren't as familiar with us, I'll just quickly kind of speak to the types of projects that we work on. We are a firm, a boutique consulting firm specializes in the commercialization of assets, really through pre-launch and launch and post-launch. The 5 areas we primarily focus on are new product planning, launch readiness, marketing, medical affairs, and market access. And so we're going to look at this topic through the lens of those 5 functional areas, but also at the organizational level, because that's often where we're working with our clients, particularly in the area of product launch. And when you think about the impact of this particular situation, it really affects brands and the organization. And so it's good to look at it through both. For those that aren't as familiar with Beth and I, we had both originated in the pharma industry 25 years ago on the client side for the first 10 or 12 years. And so we can empathize with the situation you're in, trying to navigate a situation like this that requires such a diversity of stakeholders and internal and external factors. For the last 12 or 13 years, we've been helping clients like you navigate these kinds of problems. So we're eager to kind of tackle something new and pretty challenging and help you navigate through it successfully. We've all been sitting in this now for a couple of months, and as we shift from that initial crisis management kind of mode, I think all of our clients and what we're advising to do is shifting towards this medium and long range planning now. And we know that an immediate cross-functional review of the business impact and revised commercial path forward in the near term for the rest of this year and through 2021 would be required at this point. And I know that a lot of our clients have already established cross-functional working groups to start tackling this. So I think that some of the topics we'll bring to bear here today should reflect some of the things you're already looking at. Hopefully there are some new ideas in here and in a way to kind of do it in an organized fashion. I know that many of your organizations are kind of trying to reset their expectations the remainder of this year. Some of our clients have had record first quarters in terms of sales and revenue, and the rest of the year is an unknown. Some clients have already diminished their forecasts for the rest of this year and have communicated that to Wall Street. Others are saying their forecasts are the same, and they're asking you as commercial leaders to deliver the same level of profit and revenue that you had expected earlier in the year, even though we have a different environment. And so we're going to cover these topics that will help you kind of solve those dilemmas. We'll do it in 4 stages here. One is there's obviously been engagement challenges, both from getting patients to physicians and from getting our companies, the pharma representative and the field forces, to the physicians as well. And that's been a major disruption, which will have obviously a negative impact on prescription generation. And we'll talk about the differences between new prescriptions and refills and the impact across therapeutic areas. We also know there's been a major environmental evolution in a very short period of time. There's been a major shift towards telemedicine and remote medicine and policy changes that will have both short-term and long-term impacts on the healthcare landscape, and that will adjust our planning for our brand success going forward. Clearly, there are launch implications, both for brands that have recently launched or those that are in the middle of it or have adjusted their launch outward now that they were planning originally to be launching right now, and those that are planning for launches in the next 12 months. implications for all of that. This is a significant impact with potential financial implications on that all-important kind of launch trajectory. And then last but not least would be for the inline portfolio. There are fundamental changes in the environment now that require adjustments, both in expectations and in tactical implementation. And we've seen already in a short period of time that those implications can differ significantly from new or mid-stage brands or maturing brands, and depending on the therapeutic area the brands are in. So we'll speak to that as well.
Thank you. So we know that COVID has had a profound impact on the healthcare environment. And as much as we do scenario planning with our commercial client teams, no scenario predicted the drastic change that we've seen in the environment with complete reduction in live visits for the field force and with the amount of virtual engagement between HCPs and patients. Telehealth has been available for many years and somewhat covered by commercial payers, although not by the CMS. It was really kind of still growing pretty slowly, and now the majority of HCPs are using telehealth, and 68% believe they will continue to use telehealth in some variety and some volume. We also know that there's going to be some reallocation of patient volumes as unemployment hits and increases, as people change jobs, coverage changes happen, and that may induce them to have to change their practitioners, and so patients may move. And unfortunately, some healthcare practices may actually shrink or go out of business because of the economic struggles, or may be absorbed by IDNs. So we know that reallocation is going to have impact on teams that will need to look at their call plans and their targeting again as that occurs, and it won't be a point in time, it will be an ongoing situation. Couple that with the localization, we saw a variety of responses to COVID across the country and how quickly different healthcare practices closed and what they did as a result, and how quickly they switched to virtual appointments with patients and with even the pharmaceutical industry. And now as groups are starting to open, that is also happening in a very localized way. So while the industry typically worked on a 2 or 3 times a year POA cycle, where commercial teams would set a strategy, define the tactics, give them to the national field teams or MSL teams or AE teams and say, go do this for the next 3 or 4 months. And largely they were uniform in how they approached customers across the nation. There's going to have to be a significant increase in agility in all of those factors to meet those localized needs. And even to meet specialty needs, because the impact varied across specialties, with primary care having a faster and more comprehensive switch to telemedicine or delayed appointments versus other areas where there were more critical life-saving issues, and those specialties needed to continue to see their patients. We even saw that therapeutic area matters, because certain therapeutic areas we saw switches away from products that suppress the immune system. We've already had one question come in as to what kinds of questions we were seeing from healthcare practitioners to field forces. And early on, this was one of them, was what in this category, which products are immune suppressing? What should we switch to if we want to switch away from something that's believed to be immune suppressing? So there's an area where pharma really could provide valuable information very quickly. The other kinds of things we're seeing in terms of questions is what samples are available? What does your patient support look like? How can I help my patients who are now changing their coverage patterns? And finally, we saw that HCPs really couldn't meet with their field force reps or MSLs live because of the shutdown. It didn't necessarily mean they didn't want information, so there was e-detailing going on. There were phone calls with the MSL teams, but definitely less than prior. We did see that in many cases, those e-detail interactions were actually longer than their live interactions, which might have been a few minutes, whereas tele-detailing was 6 to sometimes even 14 minutes. So that was a change that the field force needed to be able to adapt to. But we see that 28% of surveyed physicians indicate that the crisis is actually going to have a lasting impact on their willingness to welcome reps and MSLs into their offices for live meetings. So the dynamics are different, and they will remain different, and they're going to be dynamic. Those patient visits dropped precipitously to nearly 100% of physicians said that they had a drop in patient visits. Many of those, it was less than half of their norm. And what we are hearing from them is this drop, while they're going to open their practices, they still need to practice social distancing. So their throughput is still going to be diminished at least through the rest of this year because they can't have as many patients in their waiting room. So they're managing through, what does that look like? How many people can we have? How many appointments can we get through in a day? How do we organize that? How do we maybe continue to do some telehealth and live appointments? So that's a dynamic that they're still trying to manage through. And as I said, it's really different by specialty. Those specialties that could put off appointments, they did. Dermatology was one that had more drop in patient visits, whereas cardiology and oncology has had less impact because of the critical nature. Evidence indicates there's significant regionality in how prescribing was impacted and how it will open. You'll see on the left-hand side of this slide, new to brand RX, continuing RX, and total RX. And here's just a sample of states where you can see such a variety of how it was impacted by state. And even within state, the city versus rural areas were quite different. So again, that localization is going to be really something that we see now, and we'll see as they open, and we'll see as prescriptions continue to change and behavior changes. It's still very, very local and regional. The other side of this slide is about long-term engagement impact. When investigated, physicians say that their change in how they're willing to engage with pharmaceutical representatives is significant. During the pandemic, it's significantly dropped, largely remote, but even going forward, they anticipate it will still be quite a bit remote. And this says 6 months post-crisis, but when does post-crisis start? What does that look like? What if we have a fall surge again? There's going to be a lot of dynamic nature to the engagements. And what we have to do as a commercial organization is really be able to monitor trends and monitor them in a more detailed way and a more frequent way than we maybe did previously. The economic situation is going to evolve, and it's going to impact patient coverage moving forward and out-of-pocket spend. So there are some leading indicators and some lagging indicators. Unemployment statistics and shift in covered lives and the likely increase in Medicaid usage will be the leading indicators, and then we can look directly at patient out-of-pocket costs, abandonment rates, and even the change in eligibility for patient assistance programs to know what's going to happen in terms of access to therapy, but also in terms of forecast attainment for each of the brands. It will be different.
I think what's important in this is that this will also be affected regionally. Unemployment could look different across the nation, the shift in covered lives, the out-of-pocket costs. All of these things will have to be looked at on a regional basis to really kind of link up with your Salesforce efforts to decide on what your messaging might need to be and how you'll make those adjustments.
The evolution in the marketplace happened at many levels. We saw federal policy changes, which whereby Medicare allowed virtual appointments and even phone-only appointments, and in fact expanded so that HCPs could do that across state lines, and also expanded physician assistant and nurse practitioner duties. We saw 47 states modified in-state licensure requirements to allow for telehealth. And the AMA, the American Medical Association, supported all of these increase in ability to provide telemedicine, expanded Medicaid, and removal of access barriers. Some of the things that happened as a result was a migration to more mail order as that became easier, areas where home delivery was enacted and utilized more, and in some cases home infusion or remote infusion where possible. These changes are enacted now, but we don't know if they will be consistent and stay exactly as they are. when asked now, payers are saying that they anticipate a return to pre-COVID utilization management post the pandemic. So while things eased up and maybe there was greater access to therapies, that might tighten back up again at some point. And what post-pandemic means and when that return happens is yet unclear. As we think about even the environment prior to COVID, where copay accumulators and maximizers were starting to become utilized, in addition to COVID happening right now, we know that the CMS has approved the final rule that allows commercial payers to not count manufacturer coupons in patient out-of-pocket maximums, which puts a bigger burden on patients' out-of-pocket costs. So while all of these things and policy changes are happening to improve things for patients, there's still the normal price controls and access controls that are impacting patients in a negative way. And we have to really think about all of that as commercial leaders and what's in play now and what will the environment look like going forward. And customer journey mapping. As an industry, we've actually been very good at customer journey and understanding our patient and provider needs and where we could provide information that would help in some of the challenge points, especially in areas like rare disease. Understanding that customer journey has been very influential in the success of brands, but that customer journey mapping is now out of date. With the increase in telemedicine use, prescribers see a difference in how they're interacting with patients, what their needs are, and that means a new opportunity to support in different ways with resources and education, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. With the change in some of the ability for allied health professionals to use telemedicine and engage with patients in different ways, and even there's legislation that may enable pharmacists to get involved in testing and treatment for capabilities for COVID in the future. So our engagement with allied health professionals is going to change. And certainly for patients, it's changed now. And if telemedicine does become more of a norm, even moving forward, from diagnosis to chronic and acute care management, telemedicine is changing the way patients are seeking information and care. And there's an opportunity for us to gain more insight across the many, many different types of telemedicine that's available on platforms and how we can help that provider and patient interaction.
You know, the journey is such a central actor in how we design our brand strategies and our forecasts, that I don't think it can be overstated how important kind of reevaluating the customer journey is right now. It's really the first place we recommend our clients to start to think about, you know, what's the impact on that initial diagnosis rate? You know, for a condition that may not be diagnosed, that may be diagnosed a little more indirectly from a physician conversation, from observing issues that may arise during that meeting. If that is shifted towards telemedicine, that may be harder to get to. You know, the frequency with which patients interact with their physicians is going to change. The tools that physicians and HCPs have at their disposal have shifted. All of these things have shifted, and they all impact your forecast. And that's, you know, kind of a theme we'll get to at the tail end of this, is that we look at all of these issues through the lens of what impact does it have on your uptake curve, on your forecast, where do you need to shift your resources from your strategy and tactics. We really recommend starting here. This is the place to kind of start and reevaluate whether all the assumptions you had made prior are still true, and whether the tactics and strategies you have in place are still relevant, and what new ones need to be put into place.
And that leads to, you know, it's really about gaining more insights, and those groups that are able to turn information into insights, into actionable strategies and tactics really make the difference in competitive advantage. So getting a deeper insight into the new landscape of the customer journey and being willing and able to inform changes in the strategy and an agile strategy will be very relevant. That's going to lead to some level of brand message evolution, maybe not drastic for some brands, but certainly when we think about things like the challenges of how well we as an industry used omni-channel marketing and how well that was integrated with field force previously, we're going to need to get better at that, because field force teams, MSLs, and reps are going to have an element of teledetailing or e-detailing moving forward, and live details even when things open up. So that integration of tactical updates and omni-channel, new non-personal promotion efforts to HCPs, and how that information flows to reps and how they work together, and how the e-detailing enables the medical field or the sales rep field to push other information as they're talking to doctors. Those skills are going to have to improve. And the analysis and ability for reps to use that at a local level and be adept at it will have to improve. We see, even as we think about the continuous updates for messaging and for tactical planning, how some IDNs are blocking Viva systems. So we as an organization and as our client teams, and we support them, need to be so agile, because you need to know your field force is working on sending emails, but in some cases they're being blocked. What do you do about that? What's your COVID task force for being able to resolve those situations in a very fast way? And you need to be able to not even plan for it, because you don't know what's going to happen, but you need to be able to respond to those things over time.
So when we think about all of this in the context of product launch, there's clearly a diminishment of potential value in these new product launches over the next several years. And some estimates are putting an initial price tag of as a $10 billion depression on that revenue. And one can imagine that already for products that have launched recently that were just on that upswing of establishing their brand, shaping the market, getting their messages, repeatedly in front of physicians and other HCPs. This is a really tricky situation when you're in that all-important uptake curve. And there's been 109 brands that have launched in the last, 12 to 15 months. And all of those brands have to make adjustments kind of right now to their messaging and their tactics and their implementation plans. There are 50 products scheduled to launch this calendar year. We're working on a number of them with you, our clients, and in some cases those launches have been delayed, until the fall, or until we assume that the sales force will be back in the field. Some have charged along on their original schedule, and it really depends on the therapeutic area and access to physicians and the importance of the therapeutic need. And so these are really kind of case by case analyses that clients need to make to determine whether their brand, can launch, should launch right now. What are the adjustments they're going to make? How will it affect their forecast? And what will that mean for next year's expectations? Obviously, there are a whole raft of products scheduled to launch over the next coming years, for which we don't really know what the environment will be like. It could be that in 18 months, we're back to a more normalized situation and product launches are run as they've always been run. But what other long-term effects have been made now in the environment that might change some of those launch dynamics and implementation plans? So I think the important thing here is for launch planning and organizational agility in the next 12 months, it needs to be very dynamic, and it may require even more resources than originally allocated for those brands in order to ensure their long-term success. Some of the types of adjustments that should be considered here, both in 2020 on the left and 2021 on the right, are listed, and I'll just talk through them. Obviously, our customer needs have changed, and so in this kind of dynamic situation, that goes back to the customer journey. Kind of reevaluating the needs of the customers is at the forefront. The variation in local environment, something we've talked about, that really speaks to maybe a much more regionalized approach to your launch efforts. Field force agility. This is something that we think about going out at a national level. We know we're going to turn our sales forces back on, perhaps regionally and even locally. And so kind of marrying up where some of those market access capabilities are with your field force ability will be very important. That will have a direct impact on your incentive comp structure and obviously your forecast updates. Those two things are linked. When we turn the field force back on, which is something that I know all of us are eager to do, but also probably is the single biggest challenge we're going to face this year is knowing exactly when to do that, how to do that, and make adjustments on the fly. Our colleagues in sales operations and the field force will be under a tremendous, kind of strain and expectations as to how they kind of resume those activities and how that impacts the launch uptake. And then obviously things that have been already shifted and will continue to shift, there's the targeted non-personal promotion. What can we do to those physicians and HCPs where we can't reach them as frequently or even at all in the way we used to with live rep visits? Those are some of the high level issues, but really when you think about launch planning in the work we're doing now, it's really a total reevaluation. I mean, it's going kind of from beginning to end and reevaluating all of those assumptions, those resource allocations, and expectations, and really taking a fresh look at all of it, and really looking at a series of scenarios and business cases to determine when that launch should be, how it should be, and how that forecast has shifted. When you look a little further out, if you're not right in the middle of the launch right now, you have a little more time to make adjustments. And the first thing obviously is scenario planning. I mean, it's something you're usually doing within a launch anyway. Now there are more scenarios to plan and to develop risk mitigation strategies. So that's obviously at the top. I know a lot of organizations are considering even just what the shape and size of their field forces will be in the future. It's the single biggest kind of lever you have to pull for your sales success, and a lot of clients are deciding whether they need as many sales reps as they had in the past and what that will look like on future launches. The mix between live and virtual engagements is important to consider. Alternative ways for your scientific communication pathways. I mean, we've seen this year the entire cancellation of medical congresses. Will they resume next year? What were their impacts this year when we look retrospectively on these virtual, kind of large meetings, these sometimes 30, 40, 50,000 person meetings? When they've shifted to virtual, what's been the communication success around those scientific platforms? Those are things we want to look at, because what success can we expect from them next year if they continue to be remote or virtual engagements? What innovations in engagement will develop between now and then? I mean, we've had kind of the tools that were at hand, but I know there will be continuous innovations in engagement platforms. How do we incorporate those into launches in the upcoming years? And then obviously a more dynamic and refined forecasting and targeting methodology. So these are some of the high-level implications that your launch teams will have to consider and probably are considering already, but clearly a bigger dynamic and kind of a heavier lift than even normal in a launch environment.
I just want to add to the comment about the engagements and the impact of scientific communication. ASCO is coming up this weekend. That's typically a very, very heavily attended event where a lot of customer engagements go on. You have client teams that are even starting this week. The MSLs are meeting virtually with the thought leaders and other attendees of the event. But that's happening when they have relationships already. And I just want to comment on some of the questions we received about the impact to the field force, to medical field, and to rep engagement, because we do have a lot of teams that are working in areas where they've been. The reps have relationships, the MSLs have relationships, and they're able to engage in e-detailing and sending emails that get responses and telephone calls and engaging their customers to a much higher degree when they have a relationship established versus those that don't. So when we think about teams that are launching and putting new field forces in play this year, that's very challenging because they may be starting remote, or they may have call lists that are partially remote for a good portion of the year. And if they don't already have relationships, that's very challenging. So that's a dynamic that teams are working through. And we are actively working with our customer teams to talk about how do we help train the field force to better telephone skills, to better engagement, email outreach to those that they have less relationship with that might get them the response. And that's again where the omni-channel efforts of non-personal promotion to engage physician and pull them in may be valuable, and the link between omni-channel for field medical as well as for reps will be important.
And we've seen updates from the FDA already indicating that, some of the regulatory milestones may be delayed in the future, depending on the therapeutic area that you're in. They've obviously prioritized COVID-related products. So if you're in that category, you'll get expedited, but there's a chance that what used to be live meetings will be virtual, and what used to be certain guaranteed timeframes may be pushed out. So I think all of this underscores the fact that launch in the best of times is a very cross-functional, collaborative, highly communicative kind of experience within a firm, and even more so now. And so all of those things at the organizational level that make a launch success need to be even kind of further stressed and resourced to make it successessing in this particular environment.
Yeah, the FDA's announcement this week about those delays that they foresee may happen, they're still messaging that they're trying to figure out how to do virtual AdComs. And we saw a few brands that were expecting AdComs in the March, April, May timeframe were delayed already. They're planned for June. They hope they'll happen, but based on what the FDA is saying, the FDA isn't sure how to execute those virtually yet. So this may delay access to new therapies.
Exactly. And so that being said, I mean, there are a lot of things to consider. As consultants, we always think in terms of process. It can feel overwhelming at the beginning, all of the things that are happening simultaneously. We look at things through the lens of kind of the short, medium, and long-term, strategy and implications. And so I think, scenario-based strategy and tactical review is required, something we talked about at the beginning. And I think if we bucket it into these three categories, it makes it a little more approachable and palatable. In the short term, we talk about these immediate, cross-functional review of the implications for the brand or the launch. The establishment of a restart team, and I'll speak about what that means in the next slide. Scenario planning for pivoting possibilities, and really a reevaluation of any kind of patient engagement and support programs. And this is again kind of talking across both inline and new brands. In the medium term and the intermediate term, we really want to start baking in insights and expectations for the 21 strategic plan, which most of you are probably starting to develop now. It's that time of year where you're looking at 2021. We really think that we should be looking at this at least for like 18 months, kind of the remainder of this year and into next year. Refining your infrastructure to support more of this dynamic data-driven decision-making. This is going to be incredibly important, and really rework any internal processes to increase that agility. In the long term, obviously, there are larger organizational changes that you may want to implement. You'll need to start mobilizing them now, workshopping new or innovative areas to expand in, really adapting to shifts in all of these factors we spoke to earlier, whether it's unemployment, the population, the policy, the customer journey. And I can't think of anyone that wouldn't want to be revising their 5-year long-range strat plans now and their forecast plans as a firm. And so those are the things we think should all occur. And again, breaking them down into component pieces, working as a cross-functional team, having a high level of communication, across the firm and up the hierarchical chain, are all going to be really important so that these things can be kind of handled as gracefully as possible. The one thing I mentioned here, which is one of the last items we'll talk about, is this concept of a restart playbook. And I think it's really important when you think about putting your field forces back into the mix, and kind of we've gotten through this first phase of pulling everything out, dealing with the crisis, evaluating what's happening. How do we turn this thing back on? I mean, we're obviously seeing it even in the community level with states and governors at the national and the state level about phasing things back on. We often talk about it's not just a simple switch we can flip. And so we think that essentially a playbook to evaluate that and adjudicate that would be really valuable for any brand team. And it really has some of these components, but many more. These are just example content areas. A guidance for daily mix of live and virtual engagement to achieve your optimal reach and frequency. That's a core function of how you expect to achieve your brand goals and your forecast goals. What's your reach and frequency going to be, and how are you going to communicate with physicians? When will that start? Where will that happen? It's one bullet point here, but it's actually probably one of the biggest issues to face is just that Salesforce re-engagement. We have, and working with a number of our clients on kind of how they evaluate that, kind of a scorecard or dashboard, if you will, on whether those territories are ready, whether the rep is ready, whether the physician practices are ready, what's the kind of access scenario in those areas, and how to turn them on and off and evaluate them in real time in case there are adjustments to be made along the way. That'll be a dynamic process that will go on for quite some time and really engage your sales operations colleagues to the fullest extent. The direction coaching to the sales force and IC adjustments, the motivation factor, the HR factor, intensely critical here. As Beth mentioned earlier, the ongoing message evolution and data dashboard sharing will be really important in this kind of restart. And scenario planning, preparedness for possible second peaks, maybe closures, hopefully not. Again, we've been through so much here that we wouldn't have ever anticipated that we can't ignore the possibility that we might get another curveball in all of this. And so we should be prepared for that organizationally and with our customer communication. And honestly, with the expectation setting and empowerment and agility for the internal teams and communications really going to be important at the brand level, at the functional level, and at the organizational level. So these are just some elements of a restart playbook. I know a lot of you have been thinking about this. This isn't necessarily new news, but I think that the most important thing is just putting it all together, getting it down on paper, getting it organized and structured in a way that you can implement. These are the hallmarks, essentially, what makes some firms and brands successful versus others that aren't as successful. And when you're all thinking about these things, but your ability to execute upon them and execute upon them well is really going to differentiate kind of the winners and the losers in the restart. Because, as you look at it now, you're all on a level playing field without a sales force out there. But as some firms put their sales forces back into play and start turning things on, it won't be a level playing field anymore. The competitive advantage is going to shift to those that do that more gracefully, more effectively, maybe quicker than others, and more dynamically. And so this is your opportunity to kind of go from defense to offense, to really have a handle on it, and to make your brands perhaps even more successful than they planned on being in the first place. And
the slide is very much geared towards the sales reps, but it's true also for the field medical, for field reimbursement managers, for all of the customer-facing teams need their own directed playbook and an integrated playbook across the teams and across the brand that everyone can work against.
We talk about it from client to customer here, but even within the client teams, obviously there's a restart going on as a lot of clients start to think about reassembling within the office environment. There's going to be that too. There's obviously a lot of communication dynamics and cross-functional dynamics that go along with your teams to make them successful. I mean, it's one thing to have adjusted over the last 2 or 3 months, but over the next 6 months, you're going to want to have internal team capabilities, morale, culture, energy, communication. All of these things are incredibly important to your brand success. They're not maybe noticed directly by your customer, but as commercial leaders that they can't be minimized. And so I think this kind of restart playbook is pretty wide ranging in what its scope could be.
So these presentations are generally by nature very didactic. We pulled together what we thought were some critical topics. It's obviously not completely comprehensive of all the information that any team would need in thinking about the COVID implication. We do want you to feel free to reach out to us afterwards. We received a few questions that both were posted directly during the webinar and in advance, so we're going to answer some of these now. So the first question that came to us is, how do you foresee the healthcare or pharmaceutical industry recovering post-COVID-19? I think we all want a crystal ball, and we all want that to be very accurate, so we'll see what happens. It's a time when actually pharma reputation has seen its biggest increase in decades, and everyone's looking to the pharma industry to improve testing and develop vaccines and treatments and help us all recover from this pandemic. And our responsiveness to that need from a scientific perspective is going to impact our ability to recover as an industry, but also our responsiveness to communities' needs while balancing our shareholder expectations will be important. And we anticipate that there still is going to be significant price pressure, and in fact, likely more price pressure on this industry as tax revenue is reduced, as the governments here and abroad are managing the economic impact of COVID. So it's going to be imperative as an industry that we continue to look to add value for the money that we're expecting as a price point for the products. We also know that there'll be significant impact on supply chain with a need to move faster and in very high volume for those products that are maybe treating COVID or helping support COVID management. There's also already legislation that's been developed that would look to reduce our US supply chain risk and provide tax incentives to manufacture in the US. So I'm sure many manufacturers are looking at where their API comes from, where their manufacturing happens, how is that going to shift in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. This is going to have lasting impact on how the industry does business and prepares to support products. We know also that there'll be clinical trial implications and how we recover, because many of the trials that are ongoing right now have been delayed, have reduced enrollment, but certainly all of them have looked to increase telehealth and telemedicine and remote diagnostics to enable those trials to keep going. And those things are likely to get better, increase, and be utilized even more moving forward. So hopefully this will result in an increased efficiency in clinical trials that is lasting. The successful organization will really be one that can deliver value efficiently, adopt those clinical trial efficiencies, and enact more agile go-to-market strategies moving forward. So there's lots of different ways we see the pharma industry recovering. The second question we got was, what are the must-haves in shaping an agile commercial organization for the market after COVID? I thought this was a great question that came in. We were talking to many of our commercial leader customers prior to COVID about how to increase agility in their commercial teams, because that's really something everyone was looking at. There's a lot of things that go into that. So we'll talk about a few. Certainly insight gathering, the ability to stay up to date and adapt thinking and taking data and turning it into actionable insights across the organization. We think commercial teams that can really have dashboards, not just data dump, but really be able to digest that information as commercial leaders and really empower organizations on all the levels to be able to digest and act on insights is critical. We talked earlier about updating that customer journey. So being willing to believe something different, believe that it has changed. And that's not always easy for this industry. We are very steadfast in our ways and our beliefs. So the organizations that really do go out there and get the nuanced understanding of what has changed in attitudes and beliefs and behaviors and incorporate that into their own thinking will be successful.
I think another area in terms of agility is improved internal processes. And so, getting more agility with commercial organizations, your PRC processes, your medical education efforts, all of these things are going to be important to expedite that kind of agility.
Teams that are successful in having more medical, legal, regulatory review, more data feeds into the commercial organization, and more understanding of the localization and helping that local action will be more successful. Also the field force agility, whether this is medical affairs teams, other field force teams or reps, consideration for how the field force incorporates live and remote engagements within a given week or maybe even within a given day, how field teams are able to shift resources. So you may as an organization want to move your field resources from an area where you have no access ongoing to an area that you do have access and support and shift back. How can you go about doing that, especially as we talked about relationships are so critical? And how do you make the field force more agile and more responsive to customers' needs when it's not just simply a brand message, but it's more about patient support needs are different. Understanding as our customers, as your customers are opening what their needs are and being truly responsive to them. We're going to move on to the next question. What's the most important post-COVID HCP behavioral insight to consider for a brand launching in the next 12 months? we're having a lot of those kinds of conversations about currently launching or pending launching brands. There's certainly going to be an impact of behavior, and whether the HCP is willing to start new patients remotely is going to be really critical for a newly launching brand. In the last few weeks, NBRX is just starting to increase again, but those areas that we're seeing increases still with brands that they're very familiar with, patients that they may be familiar with. So the ability to get physicians and other healthcare practitioners comfortable with a new asset, maybe with a new MOA, or identifying patient types that they weren't identifying before, is going to be really the critical behavioral aspect to think about as a launching brand. Anything else to add to that? We got 2 more questions online, so let me see if I can pull my mouse over and read these. So we got a question that we posted here. What are some of the most frequently asked questions from HCPs, and can you cite examples of valuable tools and information they're looking for in this new normal? I shared some of that earlier. I'll add on to that. A lot of the questions have been about sample availability, about copay assistance, and what kind of reimbursement support we could provide as a manufacturer. There have been some questions about supply chain, and would there be risks in supply chain? And certainly when patients were stockpiling products, which may still be going on to some degree, the ability to access multiple script products and what copay cards support would be for that were some of the things we were seeing in this early part of the pandemic. As we move forward, we'll be looking to capture the questions as organizations open. There are some places where the engagement is really about, what's the value? What are you going to bring to me? With field medical teams, there's been a lot of interaction and questions about the new trials that are available, the inquiries into ISTs, and what areas pharmaceutical manufacturers are supporting around both COVID specifically, but other things like the impact of telehealth on persistency, on the patient engagement, on diagnosis. So there's been ways that HCPs are inquiring about different engagement and information gathering and how they can do that in partnership with pharma.
I think this is one of those areas that's going to be very important to monitor kind of brand by brand. I mean, that kind of feedback from your field force, be it virtual or live, is going to be really important to inform your brand strategy. You could be getting requests around information that you weren't, or that you were maybe more easily able to provide in a live setting, maybe through a sales piece or through a conversation, that you now need turned into something that's more shareable digitally or virtually. And so, we've seen a lot of our clients, obviously, historically and going forward, saying, how do I convert my brand messages into a more effective format and get them available to physicians in the way they want to get them, in the speed and the time they want to get them? So I think tracking your request is going to be really important to kind of adjusting your tactics.
And our last question in our last couple minutes, do you anticipate the environment will shift back to normal going into 2021? Will it return to normal in how the treatment journey and care administration used to be? That will likely depend largely on the therapeutic area and how much it's impacted by the risks of COVID and by telemedicine use.
And by geography.
By geography and how much unemployment and how much coverage has changed.
I think we'd all love it to return to normal as quickly as possible. Just given the scale of the change over the last 3 months, it's hard to imagine starting 2021, 6 months from now in a truly normal environment. I think there'll be some long-lasting implications, particularly up here in the Northeast. But there's other areas of the country that weren't as affected by this, that didn't experience the lockdown, shutdowns, and economic kind of impact that the Northeast has. And so I think it's going to be a really good question to kind of look at, in a way that we just haven't had to in quite some time, the really disparate regional impact across the country, and how to adjust our outbound efforts accordingly.
And I think that as we move from the acute stage into more medium and long-term planning, healthcare practitioners are likely going to be looking at the comorbidities that increase COVID risk and how can they help patients with better outcomes in those areas of cardiovascular risk, diabetes, obesity, and one would think that there might be a change in those kinds of paradigms.
Yeah.
So we're right up at the hour. Thank you for the time. As I said, we'll send out the recording. You can reach out to us directly at our email addresses and through phone. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to be able to share with you more insights, and we look forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you for your time today, everyone.